Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making Worlds. This is the third in a series of RDI Insights conversations taking place every 2 weeks throughout the autumn of 2020. My name is Tom Lloyd. I'm co-founder of Pearson Lloyd, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce our conversationalists, lighting designer Paule Constable and caricaturist Roger Law, who will be discussing their respective practices and work with us all. Paule Constable is a lighting designer who has worked at major venues both in the UK and internationally. She's an associate of the National Theatre, the Lyric Hammersmith, and for Matthew Bourne's New Adventures. She's created lighting designs for many productions at the National, including Follies, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, War Horse, and Angels in America. From the early 1960s, Roger Law made caricatures for publications such as the New York Times, the London Sunday Times, and Der Spiegel, which in 1984 culminated in the topical satirical television show Spitting Image. After Spitting Image finished in 1996, Law became the artist in residence at the National Art School in Sydney and subsequently moved to Jindazhen, China, where he makes large porcelain vessels. It was meeting the Australian Chinese ceramicist Ya Xian, who in turn introduced him to the pottery workshops in Jindazhen, which led Law to embark on a new artistic career.
Brilliant, thank you very much. The bizarre experience of a whistle-stop tour around what I do. I'm a lighting designer working mainly in theatre and opera, bit of dance thrown in as well. My career started in the music industry. I seem to have got more legit as I've got older. I suppose the thing that I have a reputation for is storytelling and collaboration. I do a lot of kind of unconventional sort of making of worlds, which is exactly what Roger and I sort of discussed when we first chatted. So let's talk about where I start and the ideas that I start from. So I get asked to do something, read a text, read a book, work in rehearsal a little bit, look at the basic idea. The director and the designer generally come up with what's called a white card model, which is a very, very rough articulation of how they want to tell a story. And then it's my job to come in and kind of look at that and think about how light's going to walk into that room, what's going to animate that space. So if we look at a show like War Horse, in its simplest terms, this unfortunately isn't the Olivier, it was a later version that we did. We just had a ripped screen above the stage and a kind of textured floor, and that was it. So I then had to decide where light comes into the room. So the ripped screen to me became a cloud, which I wanted to put into a whole landscape of light. It's participatory. We've got puppets, so the world, the audience are going to be seeing the mechanisms of the story. So I felt that light had to be seen. And also the other thing about War Horse is you wanted people to believe things that were being made up in front of them. So essentially the light became very participatory as well. It was very present. The cloud sat in the middle of the space and the light sort of went from above and below it. And it was every image that you saw was created with a gesture of projection, a lot of smoke and a gesture of light, and a lot of things happening in darkness that you don't see. So equally, if I look at something like Curious Incident, this was our very first white card model for that show. It's the development of the book that many of you may well know, the idea of a detective story told by a boy who's on the spectrum. So we have a grid of paper here. We were thinking about light boxes, how then to animate that, where was light going to come into the world? This is the eventual design that we came up with, where we sort of decided that Christopher, the main character, would be obsessed with technical theatre, and we made the whole thing like a playground for him. So we created kind of the idea of diagrams and maps and projection, and every image being created in really simple terms with light. If you carry on, so a box of light, a strip of projection, a white box, and a single character, all in the same space, what we call a composite design, where light tells you where you're looking, what the quality of the space is at all times. So I sort of think it's quite like, once I know that landscape of light, it's like I'm looking for clues, trying to decide what the detail of that is. So if we go back to War Horse, we started that show in a kind of Edwardian pastoral world, something we all might feel quite nostalgic about. So the idea of clouds, of kind of terrible landscape painting at the turn of the last century. That kind of brought itself alive in the kind of early stages of the show. You can see the quality of the color of the light, the direction of the light, a kind of nostalgic world. And then we moved into the First World War, where of course we had the gift of the vorticists and the war artists. And suddenly painting, and therefore my lighting, could become low, angular, acidic, more aggressive toward the audience. We're putting things into silhouette. Even the horses become kind of skeletal and vulnerable, and we're kind of putting the audience into a war zone in the same way that we thought, so it felt experiential for the audience. And a contrast with something like Curious Incident, we were looking at nightclubs, at digital worlds, at kind of synaptic worlds of light. So light's very participatory in the space, objects are always telling stories, and there's a light everywhere that can respond and tell stories for Christopher. So it became something of a box of tricks, like the inner workings of this boy's mind. And then I just wanted to share Angels in America, which is a 2-part play that we did at the National Theatre, a 1980s set in New York AIDS play, very much of its time. The first play set in this kind of complex, small, detailed world of revolves, which then eventually the lid gets taken off, and we're much more into the kind of world of Star Wars, of kind of Nostromo, of kind of 80s movies. So a gorgeous world to look for reference from, kind of neon tubes, poverty, kind of with a sort of elements to kind of give it a kind of sexiness, a kind of grandeur, which that's how we brought that out in the show, using lots of a very kind of mundane world that would become more kind of gorgeous with the use of neon, sort of white light and coloured kind of undertones. Eventually taking the lid off it, so our kind of Nostromo structure becomes, in a way, the Madonna video that you just saw. So saturated colour and white light in a kind of very 80s style. And then the thing I think that's very particular about lighting design in the theatre is the way that we have to make the space move. So if I look at a piece like this is Clybourne Park at the Royal Court, a composite, a single room setting. The first act happens in the 1950s. So taking that as my clue, we lit it in a style of a kind of 50s sitcom. Floor lighting, so footlights, traditionally up lighting, lots of very, very flat, warm colours of light. There's a practical light in the room, but it's not got any purchase in the room. A bit of light coming through the window, but it's all quite pictorial, not very kind of architectural. No one's got any depth of field. We had a 15-minute interval, and then the same space, but in the 2000s now. So we could quickly strip off lots of layers of the scenery, but the style of the lighting, you know, rather than making it pictorial, flat, served up, it's now much more kind of angular. So with many shows, like, for example, Warhorse or something like that, every change in the space isn't driven by scenery, but it's driven by lighting. So recently we did a production of The Ocean at the End of the Lane, the Neil Gaiman piece that was at the National Theatre at the end of last year. A composite design, so the space stayed the same all the way through. Every shift in place, in time, in kind of where we are, had to be carried by the lighting. So we go from an exterior kind of open space to interiors defined by an object, a bathtub, a door, and a shaft of light. Again, a bedroom, a kind of floating bed, a bedside light, and a specified area of light. And then moving into kind of, as things become more fantastical, into Neil Gaiman's world, thus objects kind of become more surprising. And then we move into the fantasy world. So we go from the grey kind of everyday to the much more kind of saturated colour of fantasy and surprise. And then when Roger and I were talking very early on, we had a quick conversation about risk. So I just wanted to really quickly share a quick story about something where we, you know, an example of risk. So we work in 1 to 25 models. So the set design will create something. For this production of Seraglio at Glyndebourne, we had an idea about creating a sea beyond, but we only had about 2 meters. We talked about how the light reflects from the sea, and we made it in the model with a piece of cling film. We thought, well, how do we do that on a large scale? So we got a piece of gelatin, which is what we use to colour light, and we scrumpled it up on a piece of RP, and we set it up at Glyndebourne, and we tipped the angle, and we found this amazing quality of light. And in reality, there we go. We had a an RP screen set at 45 degrees with fluorescent tubes underneath it. And then that's crumpled up, basically quality street paper all over it to give the idea of the sea, which is fine doing it in a model. It's quite scary when you've got to do it over 22 meters, but it really did work. It was amazing. Equally, ear for eye at the Royal Court, how can we kind of have a box of smoke that then lifts and reveals the whole space, but sits there for the whole show? Who knew that you could put so much smoke into light, the light would have no definition at all. So it becomes diffuse, it becomes something you never knew it was going to be. And the whole piece had to take place under that. It was a complete leap of faith, not knowing how that was going to turn out. And then moment by moment, the last thing, which is the kind of pictures that you create with light through moments that you want to heighten for an audience so they can breathe and follow and hear and see the story. So this is Matthew Bourne's Red Shoes, the moment that she takes the spotlight for the first time. Follies, I'm Still Here, the ghost of the woman in the past and the ghost and her present self, putting the two of them together, the kind of alchemy of picking things out of the darkness. This is Blasted at the Lyric Hammersmith. We're painting, constantly painting. So every image you create, it's going to be moving and shifting into something else. Follies again, same thing, someone being discovered by a spotlight before she sings Broadway Baby. Satyagraha at the Met, that kind of idea of the epic floating quality of projected clouds and stillness. Martin Luther King speaking in the background there. And then squashing someone, Anne-Marie Duff being squashed by light in Heisenberg. Just that kind of sense of light and darkness, and the audience kind of, you hope, will breathe and kind of follow the story in that intense way. Meistersinger, the morning after the night before, everything being revealed by daylight. And then Tamara Rojo lit by television and nothing else, just to celebrate the fact that often it doesn't need very much at all. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to Roger.
Thank you, Paula. That's fantastic.
Okay, thank you. In the mid-70s, Peter Fluck and I formed a partnership to make three-dimensional caricatures that were to be used in magazines such as New York Times, London Sunday Times, Newsweek, etc., etc. We made a go of it. All the work had sharp deadlines, and a few of the best were strong images and theatrical, to say the least. Peter and I had wanted to push the idea much further and decided to look for more sustained projects. The publishers Simon & Schuster approached us in 1978 to illustrate the complete works of Dickens. If we had agreed and started modeling the very next day, we'd probably still be doing it. So we looked around through all Dickens books and chose the slimmest volume. And that, of course, was A Christmas Carol. Dickens' writing lends itself totally to caricature. We decided to illustrate it as if it were being performed on a proscenium arch stage, like Victorian theatres or musicals. Dickens was paid by the word, so every 8 pages he'd give himself a bonus and there'd be a set piece, a description of a Christmas market. He'd list every fruit or nut, everything on the stall. As these are very over the top, the set pieces lend themselves to illustration. We needed to create a Victorian, cluttered, claustrophobic Dickensian world, making a world the reader could enter into. We had already realized that you could make a strong image and recreate a place or period with 3D dioramas. We had to give the illustrations a Dickensian look. And we thought that lighting, Paula, would play a part in this. So we enlisted John Lawrence Jones, a tabletop photographer. Now, tabletop photography in the mid-70s, that's food shots and merchandise, were displayed on a table and lit by a huge light box on a stand, which was called a fish fryer. This approach, I'm afraid, proved totally useless for what we were trying to do. The photography took a lot of time to get right, and we sometimes spent 3 days just on one shot. We drove Lawrence Jones to distraction, knocking holes in the sets and using backlights to shine through holes and candles in the foreground. One scene of Bob Cratchit and his family having Christmas dinner was lit entirely using candlelight. The exposure for that shot was over 7 minutes, so we had time for a cup of tea. We would retest and test again and more testing until we got it right. There was no messing around afterwards with, oh, we'll do that in post-production. What you saw was what you got. And if it looked right, it was right. We were very lucky with Lawrence Jones, as his main interest in life, oddly enough, seemed to be lighting. In retrospect, looking at the work now, he got quite a bit of atmosphere over. The book sold respectably, but I don't think it was a great favorite with children. One of my young grandsons used to insist the book was removed from his bedroom before he went to sleep. In the 1990s, I was being shown around a business in Hollywood selling 75mm films and cameras. One showroom had huge blow-ups from Our Christmas Carol, which I believe were made for Disney. Eventually, Disney made an appalling Christmas Carol film with Jim Carrey as Scrooge, using our illustration as an unofficial storyboard. An immense amount of the film was completed in post-production, and you didn't believe a frame of it. I sent Disney a begging letter, but unsurprisingly, I got no reply. What I'd like to do now is run through a few of the illustrations we made and talk a bit about how they were done. Okay. That's the front cover of Scrooge, and we'll move on. This is poor old Bob Cratchit about to cook the books. All these figures about 15 inches high and modeled from plasticine. This is the Rag and Bone Man, and they're selling off Scrooge's clothes and bedding. Mr. Fezziwig's ball is next. This took about 4 days to light. We made a small maquette so we'd know where all the figures would go. We made numerous drawings, which I haven't included here, but we knew where everything had to go. They're dancing on a wooden floor. The male goes through the floorboards, and there's a female inside the feet of the little figures. Mr. Fezziwig and his wife are in the middle, and the lady with the large bottom was the publisher we worked for. We automatically fell out with, so we put her in the illustration. And the last illustration for this is Christmas morning. Now, this is a cabriolet, which is a forerunner of horse-drawn cabs. And the coffin-like thing next to the driver is where the passenger sat. So everything you're looking at is handmade. Every prop had to be made. In the Christmas Carol, the figures were about 18 inches high, so all the props and sets were tiny, which is rather a lot of work, and we'd had enough of that. The next book we illustrated was by my favorite author, Robert Louis Stevenson. Most of the pirates in the book were sculpted life-size and based on characters we met in pubs. This meant we could use real beer mugs, real coins, real chairs, etc. And the illustrations were designed as a storyboard for possibly a film. Most of it was shot in a London flat. By this time, we knew exactly what was achievable in small spaces with lighting and masking. Some of the solutions for photographing the lighting in a confined space were probably much more imaginative than the actual work itself. By this time, to have called Lawrence Jones a specialist would have been an understatement. This is Blind Pew. The distance between the back of his foot and the horizon is about 1 inch. And this was done with gels and shapes behind the gel to give you clouds. So the whole thing's an illusion achieved with lighting. This is all life-size. They're full figures. This allowed you to use real clothes, which you cut up and pinned on. Then you could have flagons that were real, coins that were real, cards that were real. It was a bit of relief after Christmas Carol. And this is where Jim Hawkins meets Long John Silver in a Devon pub. Back to small, these are 18 inches high, and these are armatured from the bottom. But there's a certain amount of movement, and it's quite good lighting because we used a bee puffer. We shoved a lot of smoke into it, so it breaks up like film, which is very organic to look at as opposed to video. So that worked really quite well. This is over the stockade. These are all life-size again, and these guys are probably all dead now. They were alcoholics in the pub we used to drag out and draw. And that was shot in the London flat. I really don't know how we managed to do it. One more step, Mr. Hanson, I'll blow your brains out. And that's the last one from Treasure Island. The last thing we did before we stepped out into making television was a series of point of sale posters, and we illustrated characters from Private Eye for Richard Ingram's, the then editor. So you've got Sue, Grab It and Run on the left-hand side. I like the taxi meter clocking up the money. And you've got poor old Dennis on the other side trying to have a quiet drink, being disturbed by Maggie. These are all life size, and they were really quite accomplished. They were probably some of the best stuff we did. And they were the last things we did before moving into TV. We had such good control over our printed work. Television was rather a shock. On printed work, if the caricature was not quite right, we could reposition it, because it was only the lighting that could allow you to push the caricature further. Not so with television. When we started, most of the lighting men were electricians from the motor car industry. Perfectly nice blokes, but their idea of lighting was not dissimilar to lighting a Piccadilly public lavatory. Bright overhead lights and zero atmosphere. Peter and I were horrified. I remember an exchange between the director of photography who said to Peter, "You simply don't understand television." To which Peter said, "Yes, I do. I fucking got one at home." "Which of the lights," said the DOP, "do you want me to turn off?" "Over half of them," said Peter. And this battle continued until we became an independent production company. And then we were able to hire our own DOPs and lighting people. The caricaturists and sculptors really looked forward to making the Spitting Image print book, where we could get much more control over what the reader would see. This is going back to the early 80s. Redoing Spitting Image now in 2020, of course, things have changed. Studio lighting is really quite sophisticated, and creating a world is still difficult, but far from impossible. Whether or not we have the same freedoms and hopefully less censorship remains to be seen, but maybe we're in with a chance. Looking through this stuff, it becomes clear that essentially what we achieved with this nonsense was taking the political cartoon from the newspapers to the television and creating a believable world for the viewer, as we did with the books. That's your lot.
Thank you, Roger. That was wonderful to see and to hear. So we're now on for a bit of chat, hopefully. Paula, I don't know whether you've got anything you'd like to start with.
Roger, I'm just really interested in the kind of nature of the collaboration, like you're talking about working with a photographer, but also in terms of a studio, like how does that work? Are there lots of people you're working with? Was it you and a team? How do you make those amazing models?
It's exactly the same process because of the time pressures, which I'm sure you understand.
Yeah.
Then and now, I was very good at getting a caricature quickly when you roughed it out. Peter was very good at putting the warts on. But it is a collaboration. I don't think it's unlike what you were describing. When you put all those people together, somebody has to have an idea of what you're aiming for. And I have a very strong feeling about that. And there are very few arguments. And when people get a glimpse of what's possible, you really don't have to crack a whip.
No. And did you find there were lots of things that, it's interesting just the way you planned stuff, but also I imagine there were lots of things that you discovered, like lots of accidents that were quite good, like particularly with lighting and things like that, where you go, oh, that becomes more interesting, or was there a lot of accident or stumbling across things?
Well, the first thing we discovered about lighting was that you didn't need to make so much nonsense. You could do it with lighting. And the shadows and stuff like that came in to play. But it's really what we're doing is basically what you do. It's a form of theatre. The current Spitting Image I'm doing now started because I was angry about this and that, and I'd reread Pierre Ubu by Alfred Jarry, and I wanted it to do it as a theatre production. because I knew the things I wanted to do, you couldn't do on TV. Like Trump tweets with his arsehole, his extended colon that curls out of the bed. Now, it's very difficult to get that on primetime television, but you could get it on in the theatre. But then, of course, I was totally out of date. You can get it on streaming these days. And also it's global. When we did Spitting Image, we had to go to every single country and set up a workshop. Can you imagine? So I went to Russia and Greece, and there were all manner of problems. And now they sell it to each country, and you make one show, and you put some of their people in it. Jacinda Ardern, so you can sell it in New Zealand. It's ridiculous. I'd love to do theatre, actually, because I think, yeah, because you'd have a lot of freedom to do exactly what you wanted to do.
But it is pure theatre what you're doing. I mean, I'm just looking at those, you know, the Christmas Carol illustrations. You just, I mean, they're so beautifully lit. They're like, I love the idea that you thought about them as proscenium march kind of. It feels very Victorian, sort of, really beautiful.
It's a flavour of the illustrations we ripped off, like Dory.
Yeah.
And Treasure Island was more of what you see on a film. There's no mid shot in a Victorian illustration. It's all there.
Yeah.
I think there's something lovely about making a three-dimensional object, knowing that it'll only ever be two-dimensional in its finished result as an illustration. And I think and then capturing it through the light. Clearly, the lighting was a really important part of it, is to catch the image of the physical thing.
But it was 2D in the sense that the work, we got so good at, you do a sketch and you knew you didn't have to finish this part of the ear because it wouldn't be seen. That's not true with caricature puppets for TV, because what do you call a doctor that treats children?
Pediatrician.
A pediatrician told me that a baby only recognizes its mother by the shape of her head, not by her features. And we clung on to that, because you're going to have the puppet turn round. They still have to be recognizable. In fact, to prove we could do it, it was an easy one to do. We did Mike Tyson from the back, and you knew exactly who it was.
The kind of idea of caricature being more truth than the real person is something that I was sort of thinking about seeing your images. And it's something quite amazing to be drawn into something that's so obviously false, but gives this extreme exaggerated truth.
Well, hopefully, yeah. Hopefully.
You used the word grotesque in somewhere I was reading, and there's something powerful about that, isn't there? Of kind of it's beyond reason somehow. Caricature, when you push it right to the edge, and the humour is kind of has an energy about it at that point.
Yeah.
Well, you get the face you deserve by the time you're 40. Lincoln said that, and he's quite right. It's all there. We had a terrible time with Princess Diana because she was very pretty and baby-faced. You know, she hadn't had those gin and tonics that came in handy later on. And we must have done her about 15 times. But by the time she was rampaging around with the soldier boy, she was quite easy to do.
Yeah. I'm sure.
It's very difficult to get anyone to give you the dosh for a theatre production, isn't it?
For theatre, yeah. I mean, well, at the moment, yeah, very, very difficult because they're all closed. But yeah, there is a fear of risk as well. I think, you know, as subsidies gone down, and I think people can take. The problem for us is people can take risks with writers, or they can take risks, you know, with things that you can test out, but you can't really test out what we do. You know, lighting is kind of, it's all talk until you're actually doing it. That's what's really frightening. And one of the big differences, I suppose, about the way that I work, in contrast to what you were describing with your kind of early, you know, setting up those brilliant Christmas Carol shots, is that it's constantly moving and it's only ever live. So that brilliant thing that, you know, in film and TV, that you can just put the lights just out of shot, that's not an option for us. Or if it is, you've got to make sure that if the lights are seen and in the picture, that they're part of the kind of whole thing. But yeah, and you can make an image look great for it. It's like you were saying about TV becoming less controllable. You can make something look great when it's a still image, but then they move.
Yeah.
They're bastards like that, those actors and singers, you know. They
are.
won't stay in one place.
That's what's great about puppets. They don't have agents.
Yeah. And you can control them.
Exactly. No, it fascinates me because one of the problems with puppets to create an atmosphere is they've got to not be seen. So they have reverse scan monitors, so they can see where they are. They're
Right.
on the floor, and the puppet's up here somewhere, and they're looking all the time.
Mm.
But inevitably, you get heads and hands coming through the neck and all of this stuff. And I've got a feeling they did a press launch for this latest fitting image, and the guy that gave us the money to do it said he wanted one of the puppets. He wanted Boris to talk to a limited amount of journos in a theatre, but he was terrified it would be crap. And I said it won't be, because the guy that's doing the voice can do the voice well. The puppeteer, good puppeteer, and it's live. You know, it's not like in worrying about it being filmed and, you know, voice record and all that shit. You don't need it.
Yeah.
Anyway, they actually got up and said, we've never done this before, and we're very concerned about it. So could you bear with us? And then the guy got inside the puppet and did Boris, and they were a load of hardened bloody hacks falling about, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't think it mattered. I don't think it would have mattered probably if both the voice artist and the puppeteer had been on stage with the puppet. But I don't know. That's why I'm really interested to do it. People get much more excited about it than you know, TV or film.
Well, you can smell it, can't you?
Yeah.
But, you know, it's about there is something unique about that. I sometimes think about it, it's like you're pressing the air between you and what you're seeing. It's like that space between sitting in an audience and experiencing something in a theatre. It's completely different to being in the cinema or being in a TV, isn't it? It's like when it's good, it kind of, you feel that sort of the air between you and the air amongst the people around you. That's kind of, you know, when it's good, it's very, very good. When it's bad, it's not. But, you know, it feels like it's like it vibrates around you, and that's kind of amazing.
The television failing horribly. The first series we did was appalling. You could smell it on the way to work, you know. Everybody was just so ashamed and embarrassed. But I imagine that's much worse in a theatre production.
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, because also you're committed. Well, I suppose the TV made it.
I was going to ask both of you how technology's changed your craft over the last, you know, between the first and last, the recent spitting image, and also your Curious Instant show feels like it's enhanced by current technology, but you know, but maybe not. I
mean, I think technology is interesting as a tool, but I think I sometimes think that people sometimes kind of want the new shiny thing because it's new and shiny, as opposed to you actually need to kind of break it. I sort of think I'm more interested in technology when you can beat it up and make it bend to your will a bit more. Then it becomes, it's as interesting as the questions you ask of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. It's never going to give you a success.
No. And you know, I don't know whether you've changed the way things are made, but that kind of three-dimensional, kind of really sculptural quality, that feels very hands-on to me, but I don't know whether it still is.
No, I said we're not having special effects because they'll blow the world up and you'll be bored shitless because you know they do it. And if you don't know how they do it technically, you know in your mind. And there's nothing more satisfying than a puppet's fist disappearing into a puppet's face, and it's real. and they know it's real, and that energy comes through.
Mm.
And I don't want, I mean, if you want somebody's head to throb, you've got to use it. You've got to use it where it's totally necessary.
Mm.
But you shouldn't be doing it on a Punch and Judy show, which is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting about technology. I went to some shindig in Berlin with a whole bunch of people much younger than me that were still teaching. And they said that students come and say, oh, I want to do this. I'm going to do this. And they have to say, do you know what goes into making that?
Yeah.
And someone pointed out to me when I started making ceramics, and I said, I'm going to do this. And they said, Roger, that guy did 2 of those in a lifetime, and you're looking at 1 of them. So I thought I'd just knock it off. But I mean, that's what they think when they're dealing with technology. They think it's going to solve things, and it solves fuck all, really. Unless you've got a rough idea it might achieve something you can't possibly achieve. But I don't think wham bam blowing up the city with car crashes that were not car crashes work.
Mm.
And violence is much better with puppets than reality, actually.
Yes.
So I'm going to just bring in a couple of questions. We've got 2 or 3 questions coming in, and I'm going to first ask Quinn Schuster to ask your question, if that's possible. Quinn, you might just turn on your mic.
Yes. Hello all. My question is for Miss Constable. I just wanted to ask, who on a theater production team, who do you feel in closest partnership with when you're designing a show?
Hi, Quinn. It really varies. I tend to have a very close relationship with the designer, but that tends to be in the kind of the planning stages and the kind of just hanging out together and kind of falling through the sort of ideas. And then as I get closer to a production and spend more time in rehearsal, then that sort of shifts to a much closer relationship with the director. And then when I'm in the theatre and we're sort of making something, it's sort of the director and the designer kind of take a bit of a backseat, and it's a little bit sort of me and quite often the sound designer, because in a way the director's got to run down and look after the actors, and the designer's got to look after all their bit, and we sort of just get on with it and then sort of check in with each other at other times. So it sort of shifts in the way that the kind of baton of who's telling the story at what point shifts as well. And then sometimes there's moments where you go, actually, we're getting this all wrong, and you just have to, you know, one of you will challenge the other. But generally it's sort of the hierarchy for me, I suppose, is designer, director, and then the kind of rest of the kind of creative team, be their projection and sound and choreography and things like that, but designer and director.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Carrie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you guys have touched on it slightly a little bit in the questions, but Roger, it was, I just found it really interesting that you refer to your really complex 3-dimensional models as illustrations. I mean, I know there's lots of painterliness about it. Is that because it resulted in a single image output in the end?
Well, we had to earn a living, and that's how we were making a living. And until print, I love print, I still love print, but it's not possible to do as complicated work as we did and earn a living. It got to the point, I mean, people say, how do you think about going to television? Well, it's just a practical move to continue to earn a living doing what you enjoyed, if you follow me.
Yes, yeah, totally. I guess I just thought that the models are, you know, 3-dimensional, and there's a lot more to it. I like when you started to talk about how, you know, there was like a nibble at the back of the ear. The actual back wasn't, I pictured them all complete, you know, and then you were just photographing it from one angle, but actually you kind of sneaky didn't do an earlobe in the back, which is interesting.
Well, we just about scraped through with enough for a pint of beer on a Saturday night. I think if we'd have made them all the way around, like we do the puppets, we would have starved, quite frankly.
Okay, thank you.
And another one from Tom Bowes.
Hi, Paulie. I just wanted to ask about Ocean by the End of the Lane. It's one that I went back to see a number of times just to devour the lighting. I really enjoyed the underwater effect with the pars onto the perspex sheet. I just want to know your process for how did you get to there, and what worked and what didn't for you.
Thanks for going to see it. I loved that show. I had it was really scary, really, you know, one of those shows where every single moment is lighting, but it was amazing. The ocean moment is the kind of denouement of the show where suddenly they go into the whole space becomes an ocean, and we very much wanted to make the whole theatre feel like you were under the water. And I'd been thinking about what it looks like when you're in the ocean and you look up and you see sunlight coming through. And I thought it's got to be something like that, you know, when you feel the scale of water and that broken up light. And I thought, well, the only way to do that is with sheets of, you know, really Miraflex, which is this really cheap, it's kind of sheets of silvered paper. So we just set something up where we kind of got a big sheet of that and put a batten of tuba one at either end of it and held it in the rig, and I sort of stood on stage with the par can and we wobbled it a bit and put some smoke in the air, and everyone went, oh my god, it feels like we're underwater. So we just did it through kind of mad experimentation really, and going, that's the effect. It wants to feel like a breath. It wants to feel like suddenly we are all in the ocean. So it was just a real attempt to capture that feeling in the most old-fashioned way. I mean, it's funny talking about technology. You could get a moving light that did a wibbly wobbly effect or something, but it would have never given you that sense of depth and space, and because all the light was reflected as well. I think that, and it was not controlled as well. It was all kind of, so I just think for me it was a gesture that summed up that feeling. So it's really nice that worked. But it was one of those mad moments where you think, I'm just going to try this.
Well, I'm glad you did. Thank you very much, Paulie.
Oh, thank you.
Mike Dempsey, are you willing to ask your question, or shall I ask it for you? Are you there? So Mike's asking, Roger, who is your favourite splitting image character? And then he's saying, I think that Pirates of the Caribbean ripped you off.
Greta Thunberg. She really makes me laugh before she says anything. But actually, to be honest with you, I like any puppet that is on every week, because that's another puppet you don't have to make, if you see what I mean.
And was she difficult or easy to do in that sense?
We just strolled through that one. It was so easy. Because
you almost do what she is in a way. She's already
right. Exactly right.
She doesn't need to be accentuated in a way.
Jungen Glott was another one that was fun. He was funny even before he was made into a puppet. When we modeled, we knew he was going to be a laugh.
Big teeth and big glasses.
Yeah.
I managed to unmute.
Sorry, Mike.
Question for on the technology in theatre, Paulie. Katie Mitchell, you know, the director Katie Mitchell, she uses a lot of, you know, sort of video techniques and Foley artists and all sorts of things. And I've wondered whether you ever got drawn into that very complex world of presentation of plays using such an array of technology.
I absolutely. I worked with Katie for 20 years. So yeah, so I was part of that kind of development of that language. It was, and interestingly for me, Mike, it was the moment when the muscle of the shows became complete. So these were productions that we made where we almost made a live film as we were making the production. That was the easiest way to describe it. And the most successful one we made was a production of Virginia Woolf's The Waves, because in the same way that the narrative of that novel is something you piece together in kind of episodic ways, the kind of glimpses of narrative. So Katie was using film in the same way, but we made the film live in front of you. So the audience were watching the actors make the live film. And it was sort of fascinating. But when we came to do the next show like that, I realized that what it needed from me was it needed me to be a lighting cameraman and not a lighting designer. And I really do love live work. I love the fact that you know, it taught me a lot about what drew me to theatre, and in a way, the fact that it's never the same twice, the fact it's completely out of your control, the fact that images aren't you can't control what an audience is seeing. You want to help shape and let it breathe, but it's not fixed in that way. And also you're seeing it with your eyes, you're not seeing it with the camera. So I sort of came to the end of my relationship with that work for that very reason, that I thought the muscle of the productions was becoming a skill that A, I didn't have, and B, I wasn't particularly drawn to. So it's interesting that in a way the technology got to the point where it sort of excluded me. But I think, you know, that's process as well. You learn what interests you and what doesn't.
I think what's interesting is that last night I watched that documentary about Play for Today. I don't know if you caught it at all. And all of the early stuff was, you know, done in the studio. And it was only when people like Ken Loach came along that they wanted to get out with real cameras, you know, rather than be in a studio with cardboard. But the Katie Mitchell work was very much like going back to those BBC live television, because it was all live. And it's, to the audience, when I certainly watched a couple of productions, it seemed at the beginning chaotic, but actually it wasn't. Everything worked, and it's amazing. So I take my hat off if you were involved in many of those.
Yeah, it was insane. It was absolutely insane. But thank you.
Roger, can I have a quick? Roger, tell me a little bit about your the pottery side of what you. I mean, this is called making worlds, and it seemed to me that some of those large urns that you produce very much were a world in their own right, with all of those you know, engraved creatures creating an incredible sort of world of marine life and so forth. Are you doing more of those now, or?
Well, the chap that's running China at the moment isn't that. I think I would get into trouble if I went back.
Yes.
But when I was there, when they were all being frightfully corrupt and buying a little car and maybe getting a television set, it was like the 50s was here. People saw an opportunity. And of course, you know where it's going to end, but it wasn't my job to tell them. And I had sketchbooks full of drawings of from the aquariums, from going around Australia, and wondered what to do with them. So when I got to China, some people were good at this and other people were good at that. And you could put it all together and gradually found your way there. Lots of those big pots you saw, the imagery was made on very small pots to see if it worked. And then gradually you got more confidence and they got bigger and bigger. The biggest pot I ever saw made there was 25 foot high. And I was in the one studio where they had a teacup that I'm 6'3". I needed a ladder to climb inside the teacup. I was frightfully impressed. But when I looked up, there was a teapot spout above me. And then I realized there was a teapot to scale with the teacup. It's an amazing place. And what's very strange about it and exciting, it's a very special place because it started as the pottery for the Imperial Palace. But they have there's a million now, which is quite small for a Chinese city. They have no idea how special they are. It's extraordinary.
Amazing. So I think we've got time for literally the last question. One more question from Verity. Verity, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi. Paulie, I was just wondering, do you have any tips on how lighting or how you use lighting with set to create an emotion or help with the storytelling, particularly when it's sort of a static sort of scene? How would you sort of approach that?
I think, I mean, it goes back to those early conversations, doesn't it? Because I think, in a way, it's never a good idea to kind of try and impose a kind of emotion on a space. And I think that's quite hard to do with light. But I think if you read a play and it's set in a room and it feels like it's very cold, or it feels like, you know, like, for example, if you were doing a Doll's House you know, I don't think she lives in a very cheery place. So there might be a kind of quality of the light that you kind of drain away the warmth to it. So it might be that for the audience, it feels like a room, but actually what you've done is you've taken all the warm tones out of any light that you're using. So I think quite often with lighting, you're sort of working in a language that isn't necessarily overt. It's not, an audience member might not go, oh, it feels very cold, but they might just feel a general atmosphere of kind of
A
unhappy.
sort of subtle subconscious effect.
Exactly. And I think there's things that I think sometimes people say that you're just lighting a room. Actually, rooms are the hardest things to light, because so I always think what's really useful if you're lighting particularly sort of architecturally like that is to make sure that you think quite a lot about the lights that would be in the room. So if that's daylight coming through a window, just really making, if I've got 20 lights and I've got a room with a window in it, I'll put 18 of the lights behind the window and 2 in the room, because I just think you just want to really invest in the best idea, the best kind of thing that will communicate room to an audience in a way. And also if there are any real lights, you know, if there are practical lights or anything like that, it's really great using real things and then going, what do I add in order to communicate to an audience, but starting with the actual kind of elements that would be there. But again, subtly shifting the palette perhaps in a way that feels appropriate for the kind of landscape of what the story you're telling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
So I think we're very nearly at the end of this.
Can I ask Paul a question?
Sorry, go on, Roger.
I was thinking about, you said that this uncontrollable theatre, you've got no control over it, Paul. I mean, surely the problem with TV, you hire a puppeteer and he puppeteers. You don't rehearse. You give him a script and he does it. My fantasy is if you had a cast of puppeteers and actors, you could workshop to get your control. You workshop it before.
I think you do absolutely get that. And, you know, for example, with the Warhorse puppeteers, they're kind of incredibly, you know, they rehearse for months and train for months, but the sort of alchemy of every moment can be slightly different, can't it? Some people's timing can be different. We used to have that, there was a moment in the show Warhorse when you had a little foal puppet and the little foal puppet became a big puppet. And it was kind of this kind of ridiculous sequence of kind of about 15 moves that these puppeteers had to do. And then they had to be right in the right spot at the right moment. And we would drill it and drill it and drill it. And the kind of, whether it landed or not for the audience was just, it was nanosecond timing. Yeah. And I'd say 7 out of 10 times it was good. 1 time out of 10 it was not very good at all, and a couple of times out of 10 it would just land perfectly. But we could, you know, getting all of the elements absolutely, it's the kind of human aspect of it which I think means, and people's response time, and you know, the spaces being different. It's always never, so you can't, it can be rehearsed, but there's a difference between rehearsed and fixed, I think. So it's kind of always got that liveness to it, which also makes it exciting, I think.
Yeah, it does sound, it's very intriguing, because we do voice record. We don't need a sound studio. Do the voice record, and the puppeteers have to get their puppety business in between the words. So what you've just described would be totally out of the question. A practice move like that. And it's really what they bring to it is they can operate the puppet. They don't get great flights of fantasy like that.
You should definitely come and do some theatre.
I'm thinking it would be jolly interesting in doing another 90 shows, quite frankly.
Also, you don't have to make 1 set of puppets, and then we could do the show with them for, you know,
for a year. How about that?
Forever. Yeah.
Not 10 in 10 weeks.
Yeah. No.
Very good. I've enjoyed it.
Well, it sounds like there's you know, from apparent disparate industries and trades and crafts, there's an awful lot to share here. Well, thank you, Roger, and thank you, Paula. That's really a lovely hour together.
Thank you, Paula. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It was
Thank
good.
you, Roger. Likewise, amazing being in a room with you all. Thank you.